whole this subject, I wanted to ask, what place did probability have in syntax? Because probability is mostly about events, as far as I know.
Yeah, no, well, the thing is that probability, there are two concepts. It comes back again to the idea that at the beginning of logical foundations of probability, um, he explicates the concept of probability. So probabilities are no longer, yes, they are referring to events, but not in the traditional sense that I was mentioning, in the traditional sort that people have been talking about, induction and so on and so forth. So he wants to have a different sort of, he wants to not have theory of probability, but logic of probability. Just like he wants, for example, in logical syntax to have a logic of language that can be systematically studied. So that logic of probability is what he's interested, and that's where the problem of syntax comes back. So but that, we will talk about this, but that's precisely because he has already, from the get-go, he tries to explicate the concept of probability to make sure that people don't mistake, don't confuse what he says about syntax of probability, about the logic and syntax for him in the logical probability are kind of the same. So when he wants to talk about syntax, he wants to actually readers understand what sort of explicated concept of probability is on his radar. The same thing that something like Gabrielle was just talking about. He most probably would say that, look, we have to explicate the concept of knowledge, the epistemological concept of knowledge, such that then we can talk coherently about, for example, the relation of logical syntax with the question of knowledge, so on and so forth. Explicated question, explicated concept of knowledge, so on and so forth. So yeah, syntax is completely attached to probability, but precisely as I mentioned, precisely because he's working with a concept of probability that is no longer classical in a philosophical sense. I mean, this is really one of the greatest things that, everyday life philosophical lesson to be learned from this. Majority of the time that we are using concepts that are central to the philosophical enterprise, we use them in a very flat kind of way. We don't have a multi-level picture of these concepts, which basically enables us to explicate them, to differentiate various explanatory descriptive levels, various inferential links that belong to different arenas, so on and so forth. This is why, for example, we always find ourselves to basically get into some sort of petty, pedantic discussions about, I don't know, like most trivial but also important questions of philosophy, being, language, rationality, reason, precisely because, because our discussions are not, or our arguments or philosophical thoughts are not used to work in tandem with fleshed out, precisely explicated concepts. In fact, sometimes I really think that this is precisely because some philosophers love to do philosophy, because they can talk bullshit all the fucking time. But that task of explication essentially prevents you from doing those sorts of maneuvers that lead philosophers to become famous, right? By basically attaching arguments to the grand concepts, which are basically the vague, unexplicated concepts. So what Carnap essentially, what he wants from a philosopher is really an engineer philosopher. That he wants, because that's what engineers always try to do. You know, engineers, and of course scientists, but engineers precisely because they have also the whole restriction constraint of application. For example, the concept of elasticity. The concept of elasticity engineering is an unexplicated concept. We don't know what elasticity means. We just have some sort of notion, concept of classical elasticity. But the thing is that, so concept of, we talk about concept of elasticity just like we talk about concept of knowledge, precisely because we have to get the ball going. But when it actually comes to the practice of engineering, there is no such a thing as a concept of elasticity. There is something called Young's modulus. Young's modulus is essentially a matrix that allows you to break up the concept of elasticity and talk about the properties of that, what you thought elasticity is, at a specific levels of metals, plastics, or materials that you are working with. So it is essentially what you might call to be a triangulation system to triangulate concept of elasticity in different local contexts proper to them. Any sort of fetishization of anything, any sort of philosophical concept is a philosophical sin. But nevertheless, fetishization, you see, promotion is different than fetishization. We can promote reason and knowledge without fetishizing them. To promote them simply means that we know that there is no other way to talk coherently about the problems other than going to the problems of not epistemology, the problems of psychology, the problem of logic, the problem of rationality, whether formal or informal. There is no other way to do that. That's a promotion, and promotion is a critical task, meaning that you will end up in a position that you think that those notions of rationality that you used in the past might in fact were carrying uninvestigated, unexamined premises that could lead to other sorts of unwanted consequences. So this, I think that it needs to be taken into account. Fetishization simply means that we, no matter what, we are committed to this. No, there is no matter to what committed to something. If there is a rationality, a robust, healthy, lean rationality, it should always concern the health of its own self, the health of reason. And what is the health of reason? It's precisely at the point where, in a Hegelian twist, you notice that reason, even though it is the greatest vehicle of a spirit, but it is also, in being the greatest vehicle for the spirit, it is also the greatest restriction and limitation to its own self, because epochally, temporally, it only knows fractions of what it is or what it can be, right? And that's moments when reason understand that it is always constrained, but a constraint that needs to be resolved by itself. It attains self-consciousness, concrete self-consciousness. Concrete self-consciousness simply means that reason becomes aware of what it cannot do at each and every step of its own development. Not globally, but locally. That's the idea of concrete self-consciousness. So it's not like say that, oh, reason can never do that. Well, I mean, or the course of rationality can never achieve that sort of thing. That those sorts of global ideas of putting a teleological blockage against reason, I think that they are fundamentally metaphysical in nature. If we are going to talk about concrete self-consciousness of rationality, it should always be local temporal constraints of reason to its own age and to its own context of development. And of course, the moment that reason understands or basically realizes in a Hegelian dynamic that is fraught with flaws, that's the moment that it becomes critical. Not only the critical of its own history, but the history through which has been generated, through which the world around us has been generated. So that's something that Hegel calls the history of the critical history of history. And that's the task of reason to fulfill this task. And to fulfill this task, it should abandon all sorts of commitments to the idea that reason is a free floating vehicle, that it comes at no cost, that it is always benevolent, so on and so forth.